Um, Today, I would like to talk about the second part of chapter 18, where we are looking at one economy which has a fixed exchange rate system in place. And furthermore, it is the case that we are assuming that this economy is capacity constrained. So we are looking at this version of the macroeconomic model. Like we got to know this model already in chapter 15 of the textbook. And it is the case that GDP is capacity constrained, which you can see here, like there is a bar above the Y variable. And therefore, it will be the case that monetary policy or fiscal policy will not affect GDP. So GDP is an exogenous variable, not affected by an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy. That's also different compared to the first part of chapter 18, where we assumed that we have a Keynesian model and a very severe unemployment problem prevails, so that it's very important that we know whether monetary policy or a fiscal policy is able to cure like the underlying problem, to cure the unemployment problem. Like here in this model we are going to talk about today, there is no unemployment problem. It is not a Keynesian model here, so no unemployment problem in the beginning. Yeah, the equation 4, we have goods supply on the left-hand side, goods demand on the right-hand side. Goods demand depend on the real exchange rate here in brackets. It depends on consumption and it depends on government spending. Then the money market equilibrium condition, equation number 5. We have the usual elements on the right-hand side of the equation. So money demand depends on GDP because of the transaction motive, and then it depends negatively on the domestic interest rate because of the argument that the opportunity cost of holding money increase in case that the um, interest rate increases, which lowers money demand, therefore also a negative sign in front of this part. Then on the left-hand side of the equation, we have like real money supply. And the special element is highlighted here, like we are in a fixed exchange rate system, so that the domestic component of money supply and the foreign component of money supply play a role. So H is the home component, and the home component of money supply changes in case that the central bank is buying or selling domestic bonds and at the domestic bond market, and the foreign component of money supply changes in case that the central bank is buying or selling like foreign currency when the central bank is forced to intervene at the foreign exchange market. Then the third equation, this is the usual UIP condition, R is equal to R star. We have to define which variables are endogenous. In case that we have like 3 equations, we can solve for 3 endogenous variables. And like the domestic price level is endogenous, like the foreign component of money supply is endogenous because we are looking at a fixed exchange rate system. When the central bank intervenes at the foreign exchange market, then the foreign component of money supply changes. And then the third endogenous variable, this is the domestic interest rate. Then what is exogenous? Yeah, the home component of money supply, H, foreign price level, domestic output level, foreign interest rate, and also the nominal exchange rate is exogenous in a fixed exchange rate system because of the fact that the exchange rate was fixed in the past. The exchange rate will not change, and therefore, like the nominal exchange rate is exogenous. Like one variable is missing on this list of exogenous variables. Like I just realized that government spending, so the G variable is missing here. So government spending is also an exogenous variable. Once more, it is important to stress that the domestic output is exogenous. Output is capacity constrained. The economy is using all the capital units, all the labor units in order to produce output. And therefore, like GDP will not change. There is a bar above the Y variable, which should indicate that output is capacity constrained. So, like we are already done with the setup of the model so that we can analyze the first shock. Like I want to discuss the effects of an expansionary monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate system. And like here in the left part of the diagram, we have money supply on the left horizontal axis. And we can see here that money supply depends on these two components, H and F. Furthermore, um, it is the case that the exchange rate is fixed, which you can see in the right part of the diagram. There is this small suffix fix, which indicates a fixed exchange rate system. So let's check how an expansionary monetary policy is digested in this economy. Um, we always perform this intermediate step that in a first step, we are looking at how would the shock be digested in a floating exchange rate system. Then we know how the exchange rate would react and whether there are appreciation pressures or depreciation pressures so that we know in which direction the central bank has to intervene. And then in a second step, we are analyzing how is the shock digested in a fixed exchange rate system. So let's check. We have money supply here on the left horizontal axis. When we walk a little bit to the left, then money supply increases. So the central bank is printing money, is walking over to the domestic bond market, and is buying domestic bonds. Thereby, domestic money supply in circulation increases, so money supply increases. The central bank performs an expansionary monetary policy. It is the case that in a floating exchange rate system, this shock would be digested as follows. The prices increase and also the exchange rate increases, so the domestic currency is weak. A depreciation of the domestic currency would occur. So problems which have countries which have problems with their internal price stability, countries which have problems with inflation, also have problems with the external price stability. These countries find their currency depreciating in the foreign exchange market. But this is not the end of the story. So this is right now the result in a floating exchange rate system, but not the result in the in a fixed exchange rate system. So we know that there are depreciation pressures. So there is a tendency that the domestic currency is weak. Therefore, the central bank has to go into the cellar of the building. The central banker has to get reserves out of the cellar. The central banker walks over to the foreign exchange market and is supplying foreign currency because the foreign currency is strong and is demanding domestic currency because the domestic currency is weak. So the central banker is selling reserves and is buying domestic currency, and therefore domestic currency in circulation will decrease. So, how is this shock digested in a fixed exchange rate system? In a fixed exchange rate system, the exchange rate has to be fixed so that the goods prices are also fixed. And we see here that in the end, we have no change in the level of money supply. So the level of money supply in the initial situation is equal to the level of money supply in the uh, yeah in the new equilibrium, but it is the case that the structure of money supply has changed. So the domestic component of money supply is larger and the foreign component of money supply is smaller. Let's conclude for the first time. So the monetary model confirms the results which we have seen last week. So the monetary model confirms the results which stem from the IZZ, LMZZ model. So an expansionary monetary policy is neutral because the central bank is just losing reserves. The domestic component increases, but the foreign component of money supply decreases. Can there be a role for monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate system? Yeah, it depends on the shock. So in case that we would look at other shocks, for example, a shock in the foreign interest rate or a shock in money demand, then there could be a role for monetary policy. But the overall conclusion here from this part is, in case that there is no problem in the beginning, then the central bank should not perform an expansionary monetary policy, because when the central bank tries to perform an expansionary monetary policy, it will just lead to a situation where the central bank is losing reserves. So, like here, our recommendation for the central bank would be do not use like an expansionary monetary policy. So I will stop for a moment here and I will. Great. So let's proceed. Video signal is running. I'll have a look at my slide desk and then we can proceed. The next shock we are going to talk about is an expansionary fiscal policy. And there we know that, this is a setup of the graph. The exchange rate is fixed, which is indicated by this little suffix like fixed. And then we have a money supply in the left part of the diagram, which consists out of the two components. When the government increases government spending and performs an expansionary fiscal policy, it is the case that the IS curve shifts upwards. Like in a floating exchange rate system, this would not increase goods prices. Goods prices would stay constant, but it would lead to an appreciation of the domestic currency. So the exchange rate would decrease in a floating exchange rate system. We talked about the exchange rate induced crowding out effect, that the government increases the demand for domestic goods, but due to the fact that the domestic currency appreciates, a negative expenditure switching effect kicks in, and this neutralizes the expansionary effect. So in the end, we have no effect on the demand for domestic goods, and therefore also no price pressure like in a floating exchange rate system. But here, chapter 18, we are in a fixed exchange rate system. So we have to interpret this exchange rate movement in the following way. The appreciation does not materialize, but there are just appreciation pressures. So there is a pressure that the exchange rate decreases and the central bank has to intervene. So the central bank is analyzing the foreign exchange market. The domestic currency is strong and the foreign currency is weak. So the central bank has to print new domestic money and support the foreign currency now. So the central bank is printing domestic money, is walking over to the foreign exchange market, is buying foreign currency. So the reserves in the cellar of the central bank increase, and domestic money supply in circulation increases. In order to find out like how the new equilibrium looks like, we have to start here at the fixed exchange rate level in the right part of the diagram. And the exchange rate E2 has to be equal to the fixed exchange rate here because the exchange rate should not change. So, like we are starting in this part of the diagram here, the exchange rate is fixed. What about the goods prices? So the goods prices would increase now. And then the central bank has to intervene in the way that the central bank prints domestic money and buys foreign currency so that the reserve component, the foreign component of money supply increases. So money supply increases here. So in a fixed exchange rate system, an increase in government spending leads to price pressure. The goods prices increase because of the fact that like this increase in demand is not like neutralized by a nominal appreciation of the domestic currency. So the exchange rate is fixed. And therefore, we have an increase in demand here. And this increase in demand is not neutralized by nominal appreciation. And therefore, like the goods prices increase. And in the left part of the diagram, like we observe the actions of the central bank, that the central bank has to intervene in the foreign exchange market and is building up reserves here. Money supply and circulation increases. Also here, a short stop. Okay, we have seen here like a graphical solution of this shock. And you know what is next? It is always the case that we want to confirm like our graphical results by computing multipliers. So in order to compute the multiplier, we have to modify the money market equilibrium a little bit. So instead of using this natural log of H plus F, we are now defining that we can also use, instead of the red part, we can just use like money supply. And then we are arguing that money supply is endogenous because like the foreign component of money supply is endogenous. And when the foreign component of money supply changes, then money supply will change. So, like, we have one problem here that we cannot disentangle the sum here, H plus F. We cannot disentangle it. So it's not that the natural log of H plus F is equal to the natural log of H plus the natural log of F. So we cannot disentangle this one. And therefore, like, we have to insert money supply in this position. Then UIP condition as usual. So now our endogenous variables are P and R, as we said before. And now nominal money supply is an endogenous variable in a fixed exchange rate system because when the central bank is forced to intervene, then money supply will change, as we have seen in the graph. So, like, we can arrange our equations a little bit different. We are solving the two equations in a way that we have the endogenous variables on the left-hand side and the exogenous variables on the right-hand side. So, like the first equation, we only have P as an endogenous variable in our goods market equilibrium condition. And then we are solving the money market equilibrium condition also for like P minus M, so that the signs with respect to money demand also switch around. Yeah. Signs switch around here. And we are inserting the third equation, R equal to R star, in the money demand part. Now we can write these expressions a little bit different so that it's easier to derive like the coefficient matrix. So we have no money supply in the first equation. The goods market equilibrium condition does not depend on money supply. So we have 0 times money supply in the first equation, but we have a negative times money supply in the second equation. Now it's easy to switch from the two equations into matrix notation, which is performed in the next step. And then we write like the total differential. We take the total differential of equation 11, arrive at equation 12. So we are writing a d in front of each variable. Also on the right-hand side, we are writing like a d in front of the variable y, but not in front of the Greek parameters. So all the parameters are denoted by Greek letters. So it's very easy to see here that we are assuming that the Greek parameters are constant. There is no d in front of the Greek parameters, but we have a d in front of the variables. So now we want to analyze an expansionary fiscal policy. So it is the case that dg over like sigma plays a role. So the government is increasing government spending here. All other exogenous variables are constant, so that we arrive at this equation here. We want to compute the price multiplier first. So we have to insert the information from the solution vector into like the first column because of the fact that dp is located on the first position. So let's do our computations. 1 over sigma dg times -1. Sigma? It's a delta, or? Delta, delta, delta. We have a delta here. 1 over delta dg -1. Minus 0 times 0 in the numerator, and then 1 times -1 minus 1 times 0 in the denominator. The 0 parts drop out. We have a -1 in the numerator and a -1 over the Greek dg. The negative sign cancel out. dg on the other hand side of the equation. So equation 13 tells you when the government is increasing government spending, the goods prices will increase. So there is a positive relationship, and we have seen this positive relationship before, like in this diagram. When the government is increasing government spending, then it is the case that the goods prices increase. So this here is definitely a delta. So in equation 13, the Greek parameter is a delta. So in the next step, I would like to compute like the money multiplier. We have money supply here, and what can we expect? Yeah, let's have a look at the graph. When the government is increasing government spending, it is the case that money supply increases. So there is like a positive relationship between government spending and money supply. So let's check whether we can confirm that. Money supply is located on the second position. So we should take the information from the solution vector, insert this information into the second position, so that we find the information here from the solution vector. We want to compute like the money multiplier. Now once more the determinant 1 times 0, and then minus 1 times 1 over delta dg. So we get like a -1 over delta in the 1 over delta dg in the numerator, and in the denominator we get a -1 from the first part. the minus sign canceled out. We are putting dg on the other hand side of the equation. And then we get dmdg is equal to 1 over delta, which is positive. So here, money supply increases in case that the government increases government spending. So let's conclude. In the monetary model with fixed exchange rates, an expansionary fiscal policy is of course not able to stimulate output. So dy dg is equal to 0. Output is not affected because output is capacity constrained. And we did not calculate this multiplier at all. We do not put y on the 3-axis because we know that GDP is constant. An expansionary fiscal policy leads to an increase of the domestic goods price level, and this causes a real appreciation of the domestic currency. So the government also here is crowding out net exports, but not via a nominal appreciation, but by an increase of the price level. The central bank has to intervene in the foreign exchange market and buys foreign currency, so the reserve component increases. Maybe we can clarify this argument here once more by looking at the goods market equilibrium condition. So in case that there is like a floating exchange rate system, it is the case that the government increases government spending and like the nominal exchange rate decreases, so that also the real exchange rate decreases. So a nominal appreciation is also causing a real appreciation because the real exchange rate changes. In a fixed exchange rate system, it is the case that the nominal exchange rate is fixed, but we know that the goods prices increase, goods prices are up, and therefore, like the real exchange rate will decrease. There is a negative sign of P in front of P, so when the prices go up, the real exchange rate decreases. Also here, like as we said in the on the last slide in these bullets, the government is also crowding out net exports, but not via the nominal exchange rate E, but by an increase of the domestic price level. So also here, the foreigners are going shopping elsewhere, like the structure of GDP changes. The government is taking a larger piece of the cake, and the foreigners are taking like a smaller piece of the cake. This is the end of the lecture, the end of this lecture slides. So I will stop here and class. So like there is one student who had a question. This was related to an expansionary fiscal policy and how the expansionary fiscal policy changes like the composition of GDP. And the student asked for a kind of pie chart here. So like this question is like related to like KOM18. So like the chapter we just talked about. And it's about the second part. So like our model where GDP is capacity constrained. So like in the first situation, it is a case that like this is our GDP level. And in the final situation, this is also our GDP level. So like GDP is the same in the beginning and in the end. But what about the structure of GDP? So this is maybe consumption, this is investment, like this is net exports, and this is government spending. In the new situation, it is the case that consumption and investment is not affected. Consumption and investment is the same as before. But the government is like increasing government spending, like G are increased, and net exports like are smaller than before. And why? Yeah, please look at the real exchange rate, E plus P star minus P. And now it is the case that, of course, this variable cannot change. So like this variable like has to be constant because of the fact that um, the exchange rate is fixed. So like this variable cannot change. But we learned that the goods prices increase like in a fixed exchange rate system. And when the goods prices increase, it leads to a decrease of the real exchange rate because like there is a minus sign in front of P. So when P increases, the real exchange rate decreases. And this like is causing like the decrease in the net exports. So when our prices in our economy increase, everything else equal, the foreigners are not going shopping in our economy anymore, like because the goods prices increased. So the foreigners are going shopping elsewhere, and net exports are negatively affected. Freigabe stoppen. So, like the exercise class tomorrow by here, Mr. Sass and by Daniel, it will be in presence, so in our university. Um, Other questions related to the lecture, Alexander?
Yeah, I have one question.
Yeah, like here we have a question related to the Greek coefficients. Um, and like of course, like each Greek coefficient stands for like a different, or you can find the different Greek parameters in different parts like of the equation. So we have a delta here in the goods market equilibrium condition. So a delta tells you how goods demand change in case that the real exchange rate changes by 1%. When the real exchange rate changes by 1%, the demand for domestic goods is up like by sigma percent. And then the next term, like here we have a gamma, and gamma tells you by how much does goods demand increase in case that GDP changes by 1%. In case that GDP changes by 1%. So the most similarity between gamma and the other model is that gamma to some extent like is the same macroeconomic effect as the marginal propensity to consume. We said when GDP increases, then then consumption will change by the marginal propensity to consume, like by C1. But here we have formulated the model a little bit different, so that when GDP increases by 1%, then the demand for goods will increase by gamma percent. And then here, the other Greeks, how are they called? Like we have a lambda here. Lambda indicates by how much money demand changes in case that the interest rate changes by 1 percentage point. And phi is related to GDP and indicates like by how much money demand change in case that GDP changes by 1%. So, like, of course, each and every coefficient is located at in a different part of the two e equations, and therefore it symbolizes something different. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Other quest I will talk about the exam and the structure of the exam. So, like in a first part, like we have a multiple choice part where you get easy multiple choice questions. And easy implies that you have seen these kind of questions before, like they stem from Kahoot questions. And I also uploaded in this folder, like exam preparation, there is a PDF with a lot of multiple choice questions, and they all stem like from the Kahoots. Like you can either use the links to the Kahoots and you'll get the questions, or you just download like this PDF, and there you have the same material. Also, answers are provided and so on. So the first part is 10, I think 10 minutes, 10 points for like easy multiple choice questions. And then we have 10 harder multiple choice questions. Harder because you have not seen these questions before, and you get like 2 points each. So 20 minutes, 20 points multiple choice part. Um, yeah, then you can definitely expect like one 20 minutes question related to a regression output. So there is a regression output. Somebody has deleted some numbers from the regression output in Excel. Like you have to complete the table and interpret the regression output. This can be related to chapter 14, the UIP regressions, or it might be related to chapter 16, like the PPP regressions. And then you can also expect that you have to compute multipliers. So this will be with a likelihood of 100%, it will pop up in the exam. And then also like a graphical analysis. And here, like, I want to give a hint. So, like, um, more or less, we have two situations. Like, we have the situation where we have a floating exchange rate system and where we have a fixed exchange rate system. But when you are analyzing a shock in a fixed exchange rate system as an intermediate step, you also have to indicate in the graph how would the shock be digested in a floating exchange rate system. So when I want to ask a question, how does it look like in a floating and in a fixed, maybe a comparison, it makes sense that I'm asking a question related to a fixed exchange rate system because on the way of the solution, like you are also providing me with the solution, what's going on in a floating exchange rate system. So there's a very high likelihood that a graphical analysis you have to perform like in a fixed exchange rate system and then like do a verbal comparison of the shocks. And these are like my hints for the exam. So we start with easy and harder multiple choice questions, then like a regression analysis, multipliers play a role, and then definitely a graphical shock, and very likely that it is in a fixed exchange rate system. And now, Alexandra, you are allowed to ask your questions.
Okay, do we need to remember?
Okay, like in case that we are discussing like a shock, it will be always the case that the equations are given. So you don't have to memorize like a goods market equilibrium condition or so. this will be given. And maybe also when you have to compute a multiplier, it might be the case that we have solved the equations already in a way that it's easy to transform them into matrices and vectors, or maybe the total differential in vector notation is already given, that you definitely have a starting point. So you don't have to memorize equations.
Okay, and one more question. So the first part will be multiple choice, 10 points, then a hard multiple choice, 10, 20 points, and then one question about regression, 20 points, and then you said there will be like graphical analysis of a fixed exchange rate system, and it will be like 50 points then, or
20 points, and then the multiplier also 20 points.
oh, okay.
Like your exam will like only, or I don't know whether you know it, like your exam will last 90 minutes. So 1.5 hour, like because you already, yeah, turned in the group assignment and so on. So there is a smaller weight on the final exam, therefore only 90 minutes. Irrespectively what is noted like in the official system. Um, yeah, there is for example, there is one problem when we say officially that the exam only lasts 90 minutes, the rooms will only be booked for 90 minutes. And then we don't have the possibility to transfer. So when somebody else has a exam afterwards in our lecture hall, it might be directly like booked for a different lecture. And since we are booking it for like 120 minutes, we have transition times. Yeah, therefore a gap or a difference between the official announcement and our duration of the exam.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions for the exam?
You talked about a PDF that is going to be uploaded and about the multiple choices. Is it already uploaded or?
I think this is uploaded, yes.
Okay.
Okay. When there are no questions, then I would like to proceed and wrap up like the whole, like more or less like the whole lecture a little bit, and I'll use like my Fifi slides. The Fifi slides are like also online. So let's start to share the screen. I think that they should be available like in week number 7 in this folder. So, like, have you ever heard about the Fifi concept? Like, what is it all about? When you are able to remember Fifi, you can directly infer, like, from this little sentence, like how one policy affects in the end GDP. So, of course, when we talk about how GDP is affected, like we are talking about the ISZZ LMZZ model, which you got to know in chapter 17, or then the first part of chapter 18. In chapter 18, we learned that an expansionary fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system is fine, like increases GDP. Like this is an appropriate policy in case that we want to increase GDP and fight unemployment, then we should use like fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system. Okay, definitely we can remember like FIFI, fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system is fine. And when we are able to remember that, then it is the case that the other policy is not fine. So a monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate system does not affect GDP, does not increase GDP. Why is that? Yeah, because when the central bank is trying to increase the domestic component of money supply, when the central bank increases the H component, then the central bank is forced to intervene in the foreign exchange market and is reducing the foreign component of money supply. The central bank cannot increase money supply for a longer time period and therefore no effect on GDP. In case that fiscal policy is fine in a fixed exchange rate system, then fiscal policy in a floating exchange rate system is not fine. So fiscal policy in a floating exchange rate system cannot increase GDP. Why is that? Yeah, because when the government increases government spending in a floating exchange rate system, then the nominal exchange rate reacts, the nominal exchange rate decreases, causing a real appreciation of the domestic currency. And therefore, it is the case that in the end, GDP is on the same level as before. In case that fiscal policy in a floating exchange rate system is not fine, then the other policy, like the monetary policy, works again. So the monetary policy in a floating exchange rate system is fine in order to increase GDP. Why is that? Yeah, because when the central bank increases money supply, it leads to a depreciation of the domestic currency. The exchange rate reacts, depreciation occurs, and this leads to a positive expenditure switching effect. So monetary policy works in a floating exchange rate system, and fiscal policy works in a fixed exchange rate system. Great. Any questions to that? So once more, like FIFI, fiscal fixed is fine, and then the other policy is not fine. And when we switch the exchange rate system, then fiscal in a floating is not fine, exchange rate induced crowding out effect, and then monetary policy works because we have a depreciation of the domestic currency and a crowding in effect. Great. Yeah. What about the effectiveness of a fiscal policy? Like in the fixed exchange rate world, we were able to derive this multiplier here. And I would like to distinguish how large is a multiplier in a relatively closed economy and how large is the multiplier in a relatively open economy. So in a relatively closed economy, nx1 is equal to 0.2. And there, the multiplier in the end takes the value of 2.5. So when the government increases government spending by 1 unit, GDP increases by 2.5 units. How does economy B look like? Yeah, in economy B, nx1 is relatively large or is larger than in economy A. And here, when we put nx1 into the equation, in the end, it will be the case that the fiscal multiplier only takes the value of 1.67. So when the government increases government spending by 1 unit, GDP is only up by 1.67 units. Why is that? Why is the fiscal multiplier smaller in case that the economy is relatively open? Yeah, let's think about our construction worker once more. The construction worker is renovating a school, and then the construction worker has more money in the pockets. When the construction worker has 100 euros more in the pockets, how much is a construction worker going to spend on beer? Artem.
Like 90?
90? Are you crazy? Artem, you have the possibility to come up with a second answer. I give you a chance.
Well, okay, maybe 100.
Boy, this is also wrong. I give you a third chance, Artem.
Maybe he doesn't drink at all.
This is also wrong. Of course, the construction worker is always drinking beer, but how much when he has 100 euros more in the pockets? Alexander, please, please, please.
Which one?
Which one? Yes, yes, which one?
I don't care. Somebody.
He has 100 euros,
Yeah,
so he spends 50 on beer.
50 on beer.
Yeah,
When C1 is 0.8, Alexander.
80.
80. Wow,
Oh,
great.
right.
Okay, like the construction worker has 100 euros more in the pockets. And then, of course, the construction worker has to ask his wife, like, how much am I allowed to spend in the bars? And the wife says, hey, C1 is equal to 0.8, so you are allowed to spend 80, and we have to save 20. So in the first step, like we know that the beer consumption will be up by like 80 euros. The construction worker will spend 80 euros on beer. But in economy B, the construction worker is spending 40 euros in a German bar, but is traveling also to Mallorca or is like, okay, let's stay in Frankfurt Oder. Um, like the construction worker is spending 40 euros like in the WG bar, and then he's also going to Poland and is spending 40 euros in Poland. You can see it when you look at Annex 1, it's equal to 0.4. Yeah, so he's importing a lot. He's spending a lot of money in Poland. In situation A, it is the case when the construction worker is spending 80 euros on beer, he will spend 60 euros in Germany and only 20 in Poland. And then, of course, the multiplier will be larger in Germany in situation A compared to scenario B. Yeah, because the construction worker is consuming more of the domestic good. So it really depends on how large the multiplier is. Yeah, of course, it depends on C1 also, but here, like we normalized like C1 equal to 0.8, so say that this is the same in the two scenarios, but then we made like one economy more open. So we have a larger leakage. So when the construction worker has more money in the pockets, in situation B, more money goes to Poland, yeah, and therefore a smaller multiplier in scenario B. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. Let's wrap up everything we learned. Monetary model, like the policy. When the central bank increases the domestic component of money supply, so is printing money and is buying domestic bonds, we know how the shock is digested in a floating exchange rate system. So E is up, P is up, R is constant. In a fixed exchange rate system, when the central bank is increasing H, the central bank is losing reserves, and then nothing happens to P and R. So fixed exchange rate system, that's chapter 18. Then the other policy, like government spending, government is increasing government spending. Chapter like 15, we have a reaction of the nominal exchange rate, and nothing happens to P and R. And in the fixed exchange rate setting, like one of the last slides, we learned that the domestic goods prices are up, the reserve component is up because the central bank has to intervene in a fixed exchange rate system. And then ISZZ, LMZZ model, when the central bank is performing like a expansionary monetary policy, this causes a depreciation, and this depreciation causes like a positive expenditure switching effect. GDP is up. But in a fixed exchange rate system, no effect on GDP. Fiscal policy, when the government is increasing government spending, in a floating scenario where the exchange rate is floating, once more, as the exchange rate decreases, appreciation, negative expenditure switching effect, no effect on GDP. And then here we have the famous result. So a fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system is fine and increases GDP. So here we have 50-50. Fiscal policy, fixed exchange rate system, fine with respect to GDP. And in this table, you also have the reaction of the other endogenous variables. So this is a kind of overview slide so that you know how to summarize the different effects. So here is 50-50. Then the other policy is not fine. So fiscal policy in a floating exchange rate system is not fine. And when fiscal policy does not work, monetary policy works. Monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate system does not affect GDP. Yeah, floating versus fixed exchange rate systems. Like the advantage of a floating exchange rate system is that the exchange rate can serve as a buffer. So we have seen that several times in our lecture. So what happens if the foreign price level increases in a floating exchange rate system? Does it lead to inflation in the domestic economy? So is imported inflation a problem? Why? Not like it depends on the exchange rate system. So in a floating exchange rate system, it is not a problem because the exchange rate can serve as a buffer, and this price shock does not transmit to the domestic economy. Imported inflation is not a problem. But we will see, like in the exercise class or like tomorrow in the lecture, that the effects in a fixed exchange rate system are different, and in a fixed exchange rate system, like we have the problem of imported inflation. What happens if there is a recession in the foreign economy? Does it also lead to a recession in the domestic economy? Like it depends. In a floating exchange rate system, the exchange rate will serve like a buffer. So there is a buffer between the two economies, and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in the foreign economy stays in the foreign economy. But when there is like a fixed exchange rate system, then the two economies are linked to each other by the fixed exchange rate system, like a locomotive and a wagon. And when the locomotive is running, when there is inflation in the foreign economy, it will transmit to the domestic economy. We can look definitely at these shocks like tomorrow. What can be the advantage of a fixed exchange rate system? So like when we look at the previous slide, we get the impression, oh, a fixed exchange rate system comes with some disadvantages, or a floating exchange rate system has this buffer function, so that maybe a floating exchange rate system is advantageous. But what are the advantages of a fixed exchange rate system? Yeah, like the domestic central bank cannot perform an independent monetary policy. And this is sometimes a good thing because when there is a politician like standing with a weapon in front of the central banker and the politician is asking the central banker to print money in order to buy government bonds, the central banker can say, hey, I cannot do that. I cannot perform an independent monetary policy, else our fixed exchange rate system will blow up. So the central banker can deny to print money. And this can be one advantage of a fixed exchange rate system, that the politician cannot force the central banker to print money because of the fact that else the fixed exchange rate system will blow up. And then also, like one advantage of a fixed exchange rate system is that a developing country with relatively low credibility can import stability from the foreign country. So a developing country is sometimes perceived as one economy which always have higher inflation rates, goods prices are unstable. But when the developing country is fixing its exchange rate against the US dollar or is fixing its exchange rate against the euro, then we know that we can like import the inflation rate from the Euroland. And inflation target in Euroland is 2%. And then we can import this price stability for our developing economy. We can like import the credibility of the ECB to perform like a solid monetary policy, and we can like import this credibility by fixing the exchange rate. So a fixed exchange rate system also can have some advantages. The buffer system is missing, the buffer feature is missing, but therefore, like there is a link, and the link can be good in case that we are looking at like some developing countries. Let's stop the presentation and also let's have a look at the chat. Schön, 2,5, hä? 2,5. Warum hat er jetzt 2,5 gesagt? Alles gut im Chat, würde ich sagen. Okay.